What I mean by rapid is we can get you in. The ideas of this clinic is we won't have a wait list. We can get you in a week to 2 weeks. We can turn the evaluation around in a week. What I mean by accessible, you don't need insurance. You don't need a referral. Anybody can request an evaluation. And what I mean by low fee is these are extremely low fee. So it's based on an income-based sliding scale. The mission of the center that we're running these is that nobody will ever be denied an evaluation based on ability to pay. Thanks to the generous grant from the Crusade, as I said, we can offer these extremely cheaply. So the prices you see on there, that's the total price. You pay $20 cash, no insurance needed if your income's less than $26,000. You pay $35 or less if your income's less than $50,000, $90,000 or less if your income's less than $100,000, and that is the total price that will cover the entire evaluation. And then we'll send you a copy of the report. We also do feedbacks, and we'll give recommendations, personalized recommendations for home, for school, for any further testing or treatment that might be necessary. This is being run. This is meant to be a community service. It's a completely nonprofit. We will not make any money. In fact, we'll probably lose money off of it, but that's fine. We're UofL. We specialize in losing money. We've got years of experience with that. So if you or anybody else you know is interested in getting an evaluation for their kid, you can email us or you can call us and just say you're interested, and we'll start the process. But as I said, these are meant to be. It's a community resource. These are meant to be completely accessible to everybody. So you don't need any referral. You don't need, anything other than just contact us and we'll get the process started. I do also do counseling and therapy services for kids. This is not through the clinic. This is through a small private practice. So it is fee for service, and it's a little pricey because it's not my primary job. It's just something I do on the side. But I specialize in ADHD, kids with ADHD and frustration or emotion regulation problems. So if that's something you're interested as well, give us a call. If it's not something where financially it's feasible, we can work. Usually we can make referrals as well. But if you know of anybody who might potentially benefit from getting any kid, because it's unfortunately the Crusade for Children is very adamant about only paying for services for children and adolescents. So 17 is the maximum age limit. But if you know of anybody who has a child or adolescent that might benefit from being evaluated, send them our way. Alrighty, so what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what is ADHD. We're going to talk about what I like to call why is ADHD. Yes, I'm aware that is not grammatical. That's on purpose. We're going to talk about ADHD at home. What are some tips and tricks, and then also so more generally, and then also what can you do to help kids with ADHD in an NTI world, because it's been a challenge. And those of you, anyone who's had kids going through NTI, you've earned your badge. Anyone who's had a kid with ADHD going through NTI, you've earned like the gold premium level badge. You've unlocked the extra achievement. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to help kids with ADHD in that setting as well. So what is ADHD? ADHD is interesting in that I think everybody has heard of it at this point. There are a lot of myths. There are a lot of misconceptions. ADHD can be very different person to person. There is, at this point, I would say just about everybody knows somebody with ADHD. I would assume probably every class at every elementary school in every city has at least one kid with ADHD in it. But as I said, ADHD can look a lot of different ways. There's some core kind of underlying principles to it, though. And we're going to talk about what are those? What are the actual kind of mechanics of ADHD? What's going on that's causing kids to have some of the challenges they have? And for those of you who have kids with ADHD, I always like to say my goal is that the next time your kid does something and you're about to kind of lose your mind, you'll have a quick moment where you'll think, okay, I kind of understand why that happened, and then you'll lose your mind. But it'll feel a little bit better because you'll at least understand why you're losing your mind, why your kid's making you lose your mind. So what is ADHD? First off, and this is really important, and this is something that doesn't get enough attention, ADHD is a biological-based disorder. ADHD is a brain-based disorder. We have a lot of research on this at this point, that ADHD is not caused by sugar, it's not caused by technology, it is not caused by parents. Parents, if you have a kid with ADHD, it is not your fault. It is a biological and largely genetic brain-based disorder. It's also a disorder that impacts just about every facet of a kid's life. ADHD interacts with everything kids do. It affects their behavior. It affects their learning. It affects how they get along with their peers. It affects how they get along with their family. It really does affect every part of a kid's life. So ADHD includes clusters of symptoms, and basically it breaks down to what we call the inattentive symptoms and what we call the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. Within each of these symptoms, there's some different patterns we see. Now, some kids have just the inattentive symptoms. This is what used to be called ADD. The term ADD was actually, just a little side note, the term ADD was introduced in 1980 and taken out of the literature in 1994. But it was just early enough for that term to really kind of permeate into culture. So a lot of people think, if you think, okay, my kid has ADD, not ADHD, what that actually is what's called ADHD inattentive subtype. And that just means they have the inattentive symptoms, but not the hyperactive symptoms. There's what's called the hyperactive subtype. That's not very common. That's much more common in younger kids. Typically, that's just because kids don't have enough attentional demands at that age. And then there's the combined type when you have both the inattentive and the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. But there's also some other patterns that we see, and these aren't patterns that are official, that are things you get diagnosed with. There's and this is an unfortunate name, but what's called the sluggish cognitive tempo pattern. These are kids who are exclusively inattentive. They're not hyperactive or impulsive at all. If anything, these kids tend to be underactive. And what this is really characterized by is kids who are really slow processing. It just takes them, their processing can be very slow. These kids also are really subjective to what we call mind wandering. So whereas a kid with ADHD oftentimes will get distracted by things around them, a kid with this pattern is more likely to get distracted internally. Their thoughts just kind of drift. One parent said, I think it's a great description. She said that her kid kind of goes on screensaver. That everything looks like it's on, but things just don't seem to be happening. There's what we call the irritable reactive pattern. And these are kids who, in addition to the hyperactivity and impulsivity, these are kids who tend to be really kind of prickly, kids who are more likely to be kind of explosive, kids who are more likely to have problems with frustration, with anger, kids who are more likely to just kind of have kind of negative mood more often. And then we also see what we call the surgent pattern. And the best way I can describe this is, if you guys remember those sort of the super bouncy balls, the like hard rubber balls, that's kind of what these kids' emotions are like. Everything is all the way up or all the way down, or all the way up or all the way down. And they'll kind of bounce back and forth between really strong emotional patterns. So these aren't necessarily diagnoses, but they're patterns that we see of kids with ADHD, kind of patterns of difficulty. So who has ADHD? So it's a lot more common than people think. The slide says 3 to 10%, but virtually at this point, every good study I've seen says that it's in the range of 6 to 10% of kids have ADHD. So that's 1 in 20 to 1 in 10. So if you have a class with 25 kids, you have on average probably between 1 and 3 kids with ADHD in the class at least. ADHD has been documented at these same rates, at the 6 to 10% rate on every continent in just about every type of society. There's studies that show this in China, in Ghana, in Chile, in South Korea, in France, in Denmark, you name it. I mean, probably not Antarctica, but anywhere else. I don't know if penguins can have ADHD, but anywhere else, you see the same prevalence. That said, Kentucky has the highest rate of ADHD in the country. CDC study found that 18% of kids in Kentucky will be diagnosed with ADHD before they turn 18. Now, there's some quibbling about the methodology. It's probably closer to 14 to 15%, but this is legitimate. You see more ADHD here in Kentucky than you do anywhere else in the country. I've got some theories about that. I'm not really going to get into that today, but I always like to joke that when you drive across the bridge from Indiana, the sign should say, "Welcome to Kentucky. Please pay attention," because we don't. But that said, this is obviously a really serious problem here. I mean, it's really an epidemic in Kentucky. ADHD is present in both boys and girls. For a long time, we thought this was a disorder of hyperactive, overactive boys. We now know that that's not true, that girls absolutely can have ADHD as well. Girls are more likely to have the purely inattentive subtype than the combined type, although you do see girls who have the combined type as well. Boys can, it's sort of either or. Can be diagnosed as early as preschool. It can be diagnosed even into adulthood. In fact, does anybody know the fastest growing population of new diagnoses of ADHD? What age group it would be?
Adults.
Millennials.
What?
Millennials.
Nope, not millennials. Good guess. Anyone? Any other guesses?
Infants.
Actually, it's the elderly. The fastest growing rate of new diagnoses is the elderly. The reason is that a lot of folks are coming into contact with behavioral health services, sometimes for the first time. And ADHD is something we have a lot more awareness of now than we did, 40, 60, 80 years ago. And if you dropped out of school at 16, joined the Army, were discharged under questionable circumstances, bounced around between jobs, bounced around between marriages, had a string of failed businesses, you come in contact with behavioral health services, and this is, by the way, my grandfather I'm describing, you come into contact with at least the parts that are G-rated. There's some non-G-rated parts I won't describe. But you come in contact with behavioral health services. That sounds an awful lot like what you see with ADHD. So it's a persistent pattern. It persists into the life, across the lifespan. Now, that said, symptoms have to be present in childhood. But we often see there's sort of different, when demands increase, when school gets harder, there's certain age groups where we tend to see the highest rate of new diagnoses. And it's kindergarten and first grade, fourth grade, sixth grade, ninth grade. And those are all places, all sort of age groups where there's a major step up in what we expect of kids. So kindergarten, first grade, maybe the first time kids are coming into classrooms, the first time kids are having to do academic learning, first time kids are having to sit still, control their bodies. Fourth grade is, you sort of have that, there's that jump that happens between second and fourth grade. Sometimes it's third grade, sometimes it's fourth grade, where now we're asking kids to keep track of their assignments. We're asking kids to do a lot more independently. We're asking them to do work that requires more comprehension. Sixth grade, you hit middle school. Kids have to start going from class to class. There's a lot less direct supervision. Ninth grade, you hit high school. Again, there's sort of that big leveling up that we see. So it's not that it doesn't exist before then. It's just that's when we're most likely to see kids kids who've been able to kind of get by start to hit the wall, where the attention, the impulsivity, the hyperactivity really catch up with them. So who has ADHD? Now, ADHD, as I said, is a lot more common than people think. So in pop culture, fictional characters. So Bart Simpson, Luke from Modern Family, and Percy Jackson. These are all a little bit dated because my kid's 4, and I don't know who on Paw Patrol has ADHD, although I have my suspicions. Actors and actresses. So, and this, to be clear, these are the actors. So I don't know if Hermione or Gamora have ADHD, but Emma Watson and Zoe Saldana both do, as do Channing Tatum and Ryan Gosling. My wife always makes me put that one in. She particularly likes that particular example. Musicians, so Adam Levine, Justin Timberlake, Chance the Rapper. And these are all people who have publicly acknowledged they have ADHD, by the way. This isn't, speculation. Athletes, Michael Phelps, who was won the most gold medals of any Olympian. Simone Biles, the gold medal winning gymnast, excuse me. Tim Howard, who was the goalie for the last good U.S. soccer team. And then the baseball player is my favorite example. He's a guy named Chris Davis. And the reason he's my favorite example is he was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid. And in Major League Baseball, you're not allowed to take stimulant medication unless you have what's called a therapeutic exemption. So he'd had a therapeutic exemption for, I think, 7 or 8 years. And then 1 year he was suspended because of a drug test, because he tested positive for stimulants. And it turned out he had forgotten to file his therapeutic exemption. He had put the paper on his car seat and forgotten about it, which is about the most ADHD example I could give you guys. The point is, this is something that's very common. It's very pervasive. And all across, across every field, no matter where you are, you're going to find people who have ADHD. And you can be very, very successful with ADHD. So what is ADHD? We talked about, I mentioned the inattentive symptoms, the hyperactive symptoms. So inattentive symptoms, what do you see from kids who have the inattentive symptoms? So we do see kids who kind of drift off or zone out. But you also see kids who are more easily distracted by things in their environment. Kids who every little sound, every little thing going on can pull their attention away from what they're doing. A lot of kids with ADHD have a lot of trouble starting things, and they have a lot of trouble completing things. So there's that, okay, I'm going to start doing my homework, but first I'm going to get a snack. Okay, and then I should probably go to the bathroom. And then let me just check this one other thing. Oh, and then, oh, here's my phone. Let me look and see if I got a message. Oh, okay, well, this is going, and you get this sort of just not being able to settle on an activity long enough to start. Kids with ADHD, the inattentive symptoms are very disorganized. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. Not just physically. They're verbally disorganized, they're cognitively disorganized. The thoughts of a kid with ADHD are about as disorganized as their backpack. So if you're ever wondering why you can't get a straight answer out of your kid with ADHD, think about what their backpack looks like. That's what it's like in their head too. That ability to find what they need, just don't have that mental organization. You see a lot of trouble following directions, and particularly multi-step directions. Kids with ADHD have a really hard time keeping more than one thing in their head. So, back when you could actually still leave the house, you come home with your kid and you say, okay, hang your jacket up, go put your shoes, in the bin, get your backpack, sit at the table, start your homework. 10 minutes later, your kid's walking around the living room with their jacket in their hand. That ability to keep track of multiple steps at a time can be very difficult for them. From the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, obviously overactivity. Some kids, it's full body. You get kids who bounce, kids who spin, kids who kind of flop. You also get kids where it's more fidgeting, especially as kids start to get a little bit older. Instead of the full body hyperactivity, you get the hands and feet that are constantly moving and playing with stuff. You get a lot of the acting without thinking. Kids with ADHD have a really hard time tolerating boredom. They get bored really easily. And when they are bored, they have a really hard time tolerating it. Boredom is actually a very dangerous state for a kid with ADHD. What I like to say is kids with ADHD make their own excitement. So if things are boring, they will make it interesting. Not necessarily in the way you want them to. They also have a really hard time tolerating frustration. Kids with ADHD can be very quick to get frustrated. And when they get frustrated, it can be not just quick, but strong. And they have a really hard time managing and tolerating that. Disappointment can be very difficult for a lot of kids with ADHD. You see a lot of attention-seeking behaviors. Like I said, kids don't do well when they're bored. So one of the things they do is they get attention. In class, they get the kind of class clown behaviors. At home, they'll do what they can to get your attention. And just a reminder, attention isn't necessarily positive. There's positive attention, negative attention, and no attention. They'll try to get positive attention from you, but if they can't get positive attention, they'll settle for negative attention because no attention is the most averse state for kids with ADHD. You oftentimes see they have a lot of sort of poor physical boundaries. Kids with ADHD don't necessarily know where their body ends and your body starts, or their body ends and somebody else's body starts. They can be these are just descriptions I've heard from parents. They say their kids are floppy, their kids are handsy. A lot of times parents will say their kids are kind of like stuntmen. I say if you watch a class walk into a classroom and one kid bangs into every single desk that they pass, sometimes with sound effects, that's probably a kid with ADHD. And I just love this phrase. One parent said her kid's just a human tornado. There's just sort of constant movement and activity, and there's just sort of a trail of debris wherever a kid goes. So this is just sort of the basics of what you see from ADHD. So we also see some common problems. Number one, kids with ADHD have really poor time management. Not a surprise. They also have really poor time awareness. And the thing that's challenging for them is it's not just that they don't keep track of time, they don't actually feel time very well. And time can move up, can speed up or slow down very dramatically for a kid with ADHD. So I'm not going to do this with you guys because I don't know that we can really do this over Zoom, but when I do these talks in person, there's an activity I'll do with kids with ADHD where I'll have them close their eyes and try to tell me when they think a minute has gone by, and then raise their hand when they think a minute's gone by. How long do you think on average kids with ADHD it'll take kids with ADHD to raise their hand?
About 10 seconds.
Okay, that's one guess. Other guesses? We'll use Price is Right rule, so highest without going over. Anyone think more or less?
I'm going to say 30 seconds.
30 seconds?
I was thinking more like 20.
20?
I'll say 12.
12? Okay, well, nobody gets surprised because it's actually 7 seconds. You guys were all over. 7 seconds is how long it'll take a elementary school age kid to think a minute, with ADHD, to think a minute has gone by. They really just don't have that capacity to feel time the same way. And that obviously causes a lot of problems. And you think about being able to estimate how much time they're going to need, being able to know, you tell them, okay, we got to leave the house in 5 minutes. and in 5 minutes, nothing has happened, it's because that 5 minutes, to them, 5 minutes could be 5 seconds, it could be 5 hours. So they have a lot of trouble, not just with time management, but with really kind of being aware of time. A lot of times kids with ADHD have this problem of what I call getting stuck. So they have a tendency when something is bothering them, when something's frustrating them, they just kind of get stuck on it. Kids with ADHD tend to like to move in one direction, and that's forwards. If something's in there, and this is, I'm speaking metaphorically, not literally, although this is an issue literally too. If something's in their way, they're not going to back up and think of another way around it. If their first solution doesn't work, try it again, try it harder, try it louder, try it more dramatically. So they have this issue where a lot of times they'll get stuck and they don't really know what to do. A lot of kids with ADHD more likely to have meltdowns or explosions. Kids with ADHD, as I said, tend to have stronger emotions in general, and they don't do well with being frustrated. Their emotions, they're also not very attentive to their own emotions. Kids with ADHD don't know when they're getting mad. They don't pay attention when they're getting mad. They don't pay attention when they're getting anxious. They don't pay attention when they're getting hungry or tired. And the result is that the time when they could actually do something about it, they haven't really attended to it. And by the time that they're aware that they're angry, they're really angry. Kids with ADHD don't judge reward and risk very well. They do not do a good job of knowing what sort of rewards are worth what sort of risks. So another activity I like to do with kids with ADHD is I'll play a little card game with them. I'll tell them I'm going to turn the cards over, and you have to try to hit the cards. If it's a regular card, you get a point for each one that's right. But if it's a face card, you lose 10 points for hitting it. So the risk and reward there is, the ratio is terrible because you're going to wind up losing no matter what. If you hit every card, you're going to wind up losing points. Kids with ADHD will keep doing it to the point that they've lost 200, 300, 400 points because they just don't balance that idea of a little bit of reward is not worth a lot of risk. They really don't evaluate risk and reward very well. I already mentioned the emotionally reactive. Another issue is kids with ADHD have a hard time with sequencing. So a lot of what we teach kids to do, we teach them to do things kind of in sequence. Think about getting dressed. I can hear my dogs alerting me to there being nothing going on. Think about getting dressed. We tend to do things in a certain order. We don't even think about it. Some people get their top half dressed before their bottom half. Others the other way around. Some put their left sock on before their right sock, or the other way around. You probably never even think about it, but you have sequences that you do things in. Kids with ADHD have a harder time maintaining sequence. If your kid has ever gotten dressed and you realize they're not wearing any underwear, or they're only wearing one sock, it's that sequence. They just don't follow that sequence. They just kind of don't internally sequence things quite as well. So we also see some common co-occurring difficulties. Kids with ADHD are a lot more likely to have problems with emotions and behavior. About 30% of kids with ADHD also have problems with anxiety. We don't think about ADHD and anxiety going together. They can seem like polar opposites, but they occur together fairly commonly, and it's a very interesting mix. It can cause, I will say this, kids with ADHD and anxiety don't look like what we think kids with anxiety would look like. It's much more active. It's more likely to come out as irritability. They are more likely to have mood problems. Kids with ADHD are more prone to depression, behavior problems. Kids with ADHD are more likely to have problems with getting along with their peers. They're more likely to be both victims of and perpetrators of teasing and bullying. They're more likely to just have drama in their friendships. Kids with ADHD can make friends quickly, but they tend to burn through friendships fairly quickly too. We see higher rates of learning disorders, higher rates of problems in school, and actually substantially higher rates of risk of injury. There are estimates that ADHD contributes to, I think the last estimate I heard was something like $38 billion worth of physical health costs each year. I would guess a substantial amount starts with either, I bet you can't, I dare you to, or my favorite, hey, check this out. But because of that acting without thinking and that ability to judge risk and reward, they just don't seem to have quite the same, as I said, sort of evaluation or awareness of risk. So why does ADHD happen? Primarily genetics. So ADHD does tend to run in families. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if your kid has ADHD, you have ADHD, or that if you have ADHD, your kid will have ADHD, but we do see it tends to run in families, that It's not uncommon that you have a kid who reminds you a lot of an uncle or a grandparent or a spouse. There are a lot of times when I do these talks, if I've got families that one parent looks over at the other one, and it's kind of like, you can tell they're kind of thinking, you're talking about you, aren't you? It's primarily a neurological deficit. So it's what it is the frontal lobe, the front part of the brain, which is the last part of the brain to mature and develop, actually doesn't reach full maturity until your 20s. Kids with ADHD, that frontal lobe just doesn't develop as strongly. It doesn't work quite as efficiently. And that frontal lobe does two main things. It's the brain's filing cabinet and it's the brain's brakes. So if you think about the front part of the brain as being like a secretary, good secretary screens in what information is important and what's not, what calls need to go back to the main office and what calls don't. When information comes in, it's got to be filed. You've got a good frontal lobe, a good filing cabinet. You open it up and everything's color-coded, everything's alphabetized, everything's in chronological order. You get a piece of paper, you know exactly where to put it. Kids with ADHD, their secretary's been out on lunch break for the last 10 years. They don't have that. What I mean by that is they take in information, but they don't know how to filter what information is relevant and what's not. Or I should say they don't know how to. They're not as good at it or not as efficient. So they have a harder time encoding. They don't necessarily kind of filter through what in their environment should they pay attention to and what should they not. They also, their filing cabinet, it's not that they don't take in information. They've got the filing cabinet. They just don't have the files. They get a piece of paper, they open the drawer and throw it in. So later on, when they're trying to answer a question, how do you calculate the square root? What is 5 times 5? Where are their shoes? What is that thing on their head? When they're trying to come up with that information, they've got to rummage through all those papers to figure out what's the information they need. The frontal lobe also serves as the brain's brakes. The brain sends out a lot of impulses. Do this, touch that, try this, smell that, lick that. The frontal lobe is the part that is supposed to put the brakes on and go, slow down. Not a good idea. Kids with ADHD, that the brakes just don't kick in time. And so a lot of times they will do things that they know they shouldn't do, but they know they shouldn't do them as they're doing them. They don't realize they're doing them until they're doing them. If you've got a kid with ADHD, I'm sure you've experienced you ask them, why did you do that? And you kind of get that blank look of why, I don't know, which is so frustrating as a parent because we'd almost rather they have like a master plan to drive us nuts than it be, I don't know. But the truth is they don't. It's because it's that impulsivity. It's that frontal lobe, the brakes just haven't kicked in quickly enough. So I'm going to go through the bottom part of the slide. I'm going to skip because we're going to go through each one of these, but I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of what are the core deficits. Why are kids with ADHD, why do they have some of these difficulties? So attention. Attention is very important, obviously, to ADHD. It's part of the title, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Kids with ADHD have a lot of problems with attention, and attention is more complicated than we realize. You've probably told your kid to pay attention. Or if you're a teacher, you've probably told your students to pay attention. But what do we mean? What does pay attention mean? Pay attention means pay attention to the thing I want you to pay attention to. Don't pay attention to anything else. And keep your attention on it, but also know when it's time to take your attention off of it. Kids with ADHD have a lot less control of their attention. So their attention is, yeah, absolutely. Please feel free to post questions or just unmute your mic and chime in. Their attention is a lot more impulsive. So they have a lot less control over their attention. And what do we pay attention to? We pay attention to whatever's most sort of relevant. What's loudest? What is brightest? What has flashing lights or moving colors? You think about about sort of how our attention systems are hardwired. If you're out in the jungle and there's a loud, you're picking berries and there's a loud growl coming from off to the side, you don't want to have to think about whether to pay attention to it. Your body needs to know, okay, pay attention to that. That's more important than anything else. The problem is for kids, oftentimes the things that we want them to pay attention to are less stimulating than the things that are in their environment. So particularly once they get in a classroom, other kids are about the most relevant thing for them to pay attention to. Video games. Video games have flashing lights, loud noises, bright colors. They have a lot more trouble. It's not just they have trouble paying attention, it's they have a lot of trouble not paying attention to things in their environment, blocking things out. They also have to work harder to keep their attention on things. And the result is their attention gets fatigued a lot quicker. You want to know what attentional fatigue feels like? Have you ever tried to read the end user license agreement when you get a new phone or download a new app or new piece of software? Have you ever really tried to read the whole thing? Or tried to read the rental agreement when you rent a car? Or tried to read the fine print on anything? Try doing it, and you will find that by probably the 6th or 7th word, your eyes start to fog. Your brain feels foggy. It's like you can't even process the words. They're actually, actually, this is a little side note, they're written specifically so you can't pay attention to them. But that's how it is for kids with ADHD. Their attention fatigues very quickly. So one of the reasons why they get distracted so easily is because they just get tired paying attention. Paying attention is hard for them. They have to work a lot harder. They also don't monitor their attention very well. They don't pay attention to when they're paying attention. So a lot of times when kids with ADHD are getting off task, it's not that they're not trying to concentrate. It's that they don't even realize they're off task. They're working, and then they're just kind of not. But if they're not working, they don't realize they're not working. A lot of times parents will complain about kids with ADHD doing what we call hyperfocus, especially on video games. I can't tell you how often I hear, well, I don't know if they could have ADHD because you can pay attention to video games for hours. That's, again, you think about that control of attention. Well, the problem with the kids with ADHD have is they can't take their attention off of video games. Because there's so much stimulation, that's the most stimulating thing to them. They can't direct their attention off of it. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with kids, 8, 10, 12-year-old kids who have been so unable to take their attention off of video games, they've wound up peeing in their pants basically while they're playing. Or at the last minute, basically really having to run to the bathroom because they don't even pay attention to their own bodies. Their attention is so fixed on the most stimulating thing, they're not even able to pay attention to what's going on in their own bodies. They have a lot of difficulty holding information in their mind, and the problem is sort of throughout the process. They have a hard time paying attention. They also have a hard time storing things, and they have a hard time retrieving things mentally. Organization is a real problem. So kids with ADHD have what I like to call black hole backpack. Black hole backpack, I've been proposing this as a study with my colleagues in the physics department. It's a gravitational anomaly that occurs exclusively in the backpack of a kid with ADHD, where you can put anything in it, no matter how big, and if it's important, it'll disappear. So it could be permission slip. It could be that homework assignment they swore they did. It could be their jacket. It could be their little brother. Whatever goes into their backpack, it disappears. And then there's, at the end of the year, there's a shifting in polarity, and it all comes back out. And everything that they swore that they had lost, or that they swore you never gave them, it all comes out at the end of the year. But they're just physically disorganized. And there's these what we call glitches. And they really are kind of like mental glitches kids have. I already mentioned the time thing, but they have what I like to call the I know where it is glitch. If you give them something, they'll put it down. Well, I know where it is. It's right there. That's where my phone is. That's where my Chromebook is. That's where my homework is. That's where my shoes are. They're there. I can see them. What they don't realize is that the moment their attention goes off of it, they haven't encoded it. They just know it's there because they're looking at it. The moment they stop looking at it, it's not there anymore. Mentally, they don't have that representation of it's there. So that's one of the reasons why they tend to lose stuff and why they're so disorganized is they'll put something anywhere, and as long as they remember where it is right now, they assume they're going to remember where it is later. Kids with ADHD, this is a real issue kids with ADHD have, is they don't distinguish between now and later very well. So whatever I know now, I'll know later, as opposed to I know it now, but if I haven't put it somewhere where I will remember it, I won't remember it later. They have kind of a memory glitch too. So same thing of I remember, if I know what it is now, I don't need to write down what my homework is because I know what I've got to do. I don't need to, I don't need to keep track of anything because I remember it right now, but I'll forget it the moment I learn something else. And this makes starting tasks a lot more challenging. And this is a real thinking about NTI, both attention and organization. This is one of the reasons why it's so challenging for kids with ADHD. Staring at a computer screen that has a person talking on it is not interesting. And I very much appreciate you guys are all staring at me. But Zoom fatigue is real. You're staring at 2D representations of people who are not doing anything interesting. Now, if my dog came in, that would make this more interesting because that would be at least different. But we're asking kids who have a hard time focusing their attention on low stimulating things anyway to spend their entire days now staring at a screen. And we're asking them to keep themselves organized and keep their minds and their thoughts organized in ways that they just really don't do very well. Impulsivity, I'm going to kind of skip through this just because in the interest of time. But impulsivity is probably the single biggest reason kids with ADHD get in trouble. Impulsivity is not just, I will say it's not just behavioral. Verbal impulsivity is a real problem for kids with ADHD. And so is emotional impulsivity. So kids with ADHD have a tendency to say the thing that you shouldn't say and realize they shouldn't say it as they've said it. And then as a result of the emotional impulsivity, they do have a lot more difficulty with frustration and just being able to manage disappointment, manage negative emotion, kind of manage themselves. I'm going to skip through this again just because of time. So how do we help our kids with ADHD? So one thing to remember is the problems aren't always obvious. What makes sense to you doesn't make sense to them. And what makes sense to them may not make sense to you. Their brains are wired differently. And this is true of all kids, not just kids with ADHD. That as adults, we tend to forget how kids think. We assume that kids are logical, rational creatures because we think that we are logical, rational creatures. Our kids are not logical, rational creatures. The truth is, neither are we. Humans are not logical, rational creatures. And the more emotional, illogical we are, the more rational we think we're being. But since the problems aren't always obvious, the solutions aren't always going to be obvious either. Sometimes the best idea isn't going to be the idea that works. So helping kids kind of think through problems, being willing to be flexible, helping them, kind of the idea of coming up with multiple solutions, trying different things can be very important. Remember that development doesn't happen in a straight line. Just because your kid can do something doesn't mean they're always going to do it. Just because your kid has learned a skill doesn't mean they're always going to perform that skill. Even typically functioning kids will backslide a lot. Kids with ADHD will backslide way more than you would think possible. Their ability to ping pong between kind of astonishing you with how well they can do and astonishing you with how little they can do, sometimes in the same 5 minutes, is I think that's something we really underestimate. One of the hallmarks of ADHD is what I call consistent inconsistency. Kids with ADHD are consistently inconsistent. So they will get they'll get an 100 on one test and a 30 on the next. They will behave great and then they will behave terribly. They will, they'll be able to do something one time and not be able to do it the next. You see a lot of this consistent inconsistency. And one thing that's really important here is understanding and empathy. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, your kids, especially your kids with ADHD, they don't understand themselves. They don't understand why they have the problems they do. They see other kids who don't have the problems they have, and they assume that they shouldn't have them either. For them to feel like you understand them, for them to feel like you validate them, it can make a world of difference. Having empathy for your kids with ADHD, understanding that for the most part, they want to behave. In fact, they're often trying harder to behave than kids without ADHD because they have to. But they're trying and failing, and that's even harder. They're having to do things repeatedly that are hard for them. They're making mistakes repeatedly. Kids with ADHD get very, very used to failure. They are way more used to failure than most people are because they're repeatedly put in situations where they have to do the things that are hardest for them. They have to sit still. They have to control their bodies. They have to follow rules. They have to remember things. It's really, really hard being a kid with ADHD. And they won't always show it because kids with ADHD are so focused on now that you will get a lot of this terrible thing happened and 5 minutes later, it seems like they don't care. It's because that was then and this is now. But under the surface, that's still there. So being able to show understanding and empathy for kids with ADHD really is crucial. So one of the things that's really important is thinking about why do kids with ADHD struggle? Why do they have the challenges they do? They've got the problems with attention, impulsivity. They have a hard time remembering directions and following directions. They are very prone to emotionally driven behavior. They're very prone to act on emotion and to have stronger emotions that can make it harder for them to do what they need to do. they're very prone to boredom, fatigue, hunger, and yes, sometimes willful defiance. I mean, look, kids are kids. None of you guys were perfect as kids. I'm sure if I talked to your all's parents, they would all be able to tell me things that you did as a kid that you now are telling your kid not to do. Parenting, this is something I've experienced. Nothing will make you into a bigger hypocrite than being a parent. Absolutely nothing. Probably at least once an hour, I find myself telling my kid not to do something that either I used to do as a kid, or to be honest, I still do. But now nobody can tell me not to do it. But it is really important to remember that kids really want to comply. But a really sort of important part here is try to anticipate and plan for what could go wrong instead of hoping things won't go right, or hoping things will go right. Yes, there are times when it would be great if your kid could turn off their ADHD. There are times when you really just need them to kind of put their ADHD aside, but they can't. If they could, they would. And so remember that in those situations where it's going to be hardest to deal with ADHD, try to anticipate and have a plan for what could go wrong instead of just really hoping they decide to not be ADHD at that moment. So I guess we're a little bit short on time. I'll go through these a little bit quickly. I do want to kind of hit on a couple of these points. Effective instructions. One thing that's really important for kids with ADHD is being really clear on what you're asking them and telling them to do. Number one, if you don't have your child's attention, they don't understand what you said. And the say back to me what I said thing doesn't necessarily work. Kids can repeat back things without paying attention to them. So you tell them to go clean their room, and then you say, what did I tell you to do? And they say, clean my room. That doesn't mean they processed it. But saying, well, so what are you going to have to do to clean your room? That's a way you can kind of tell if they're listening. Asking them to actually process it and act on it. Give instructions directly, specifically, and simply. So clean your room is actually a good example. Clean your room is not an effective instruction. There are 16 people right now. Every single one of you have a different definition of clean your room. And think back to when you were a kid. What did clean your room mean? Did you have to make your bed? Did you have to fold your laundry? Did you have to clean things off the floor? Did you have to vacuum? Did you have to dust? Was it the white glove test on the baseboard? Every one of those could be the definition of clean your room, or it could be all of them or any combination of those. If I was a kid and I went over to your house and your parents said clean your room, they would think I was. There were four of us, and my brother and I shared a room in a small apartment. So my parents, they did their best, but clean your room basically meant there had to be a pathway from the door to your bed, and the sheets had to be somewhere near the bed. So if they were hanging from the ceiling fan or something, that wasn't okay. But if I went to your house and your parents said clean your room, I would have no idea what they wanted me to do. Being specific, giving commands one at a time, giving simple instructions, and telling your kids what to do and instead of what not to do. Don't hit your sister is not an effective instruction, because there's a lot of loopholes there. There's a lot of, okay, I won't hit my sister. I can pinch her. I can kick her. I can stare at her. I can poke her. I can flick her ear. So phrasing instructions positively. Keep your hands and feet to yourself. Using instructions where you're telling kids what to do can make a big difference. Making sure that you give kids a chance to comply. Making sure that you praise kids when they comply. And remember, if it has a question mark on the end, it's not an instruction. So if you say, can you get started on your homework? And your kid says no, your kid has followed your instructions. You asked them a question and they answered. Let's is not an instruction. Let's do our homework. Okay, you start. I'll watch video. I'll watch TV. You start doing my homework, and then, because let's implies we're both going to do it. So being clear, being specific, being direct. You can say please. Please start your homework is not there. There's no question mark on the end there. But remember that kids make the best lawyers. So if there's a loophole, your kid will find it. So giving small, simple instructions can really help help your kids. Trying to set your kids up for success. So what we call scaffolding. Getting your kids started, playing to their strengths. These are really important things. So an example of this would be your kid has a hard time doing their work. Whether it's NTI, whether it's homework, your kid has a hard time doing their work independently. What do we say? We say, okay, get started. If you need help with something, let me know. We come in 30 minutes later and they haven't even started. We know they know how to do problem 1, 2, and 3. Why haven't they started? It's because the difficulty is not necessarily in the doing, it's the starting it. So what I always say, with any kind of task that you want your kids to do, I say, imagine it's like riding a bike. When you teach a kid to ride a bike, you start by holding the seat up. You start by holding them up until they have enough momentum they can do it on their own. Helping kids on the front end, helping them start, helping them do the first thing they need to do. And the second thing, oftentimes then they're able to do it independently. So instead of waiting for them to have trouble, and then by the time that you jump in, they're frustrated, you're frustrated, everybody's pressed for time, really kind of helping scaffold, helping provide the help on the front end can really be helpful. In terms of attention, and this is probably the last slide that we'll have time to go over because I want to make sure we have some time for questions, and I can stay on past 7 if need be, since we got started kind of late. Kids with ADHD are very motivated by attention. Here's another thing that I think is important to remember. Kids with ADHD encounter an astonishing amount of negativity. The average kid without ADHD hears 4 times as many positive comments as negative comments. The average kid with ADHD hears twice as many negative comments as positive comments. Every time they hear don't, stop, no, why don't you, why haven't you? Every time, it's another check in the negative box. Kids with ADHD are often very worn down. They are often, and by 5, 6, 7, kids with ADHD have encountered a lifetime of negativity. Giving kids praise, giving kids positive attention, and giving kids, and this is really important, not just earned praise. So to catch them being good thing, I'm sure you guys have heard that, when you see them doing something, positive praise, and that's important, but giving kids unearned praise too. We make kids with ADHD work harder for praise. So praising kids with ADHD, even when they've had a bad day, even when they've had trouble, finding positive things that you can praise them for. Praising them for behavior, but also for their character. So kids, not just kids with ADHD, but kids in general, they really behave. Basically, they look at you are how you behave. What you do is who you are. If your behavior is problematic, then you're trouble. If people don't like your behavior, then people don't like you. Praising their character, praising not just what they do, but praising them for who they are. Because our kids are great, even when they drive us nuts. They're smart, they're funny, they're kind, they're goofy, they're all these positive things that we could think about them, and we tell other people about them, but we don't tell them. Letting your kids hear that positivity from you for what they do, for who they are, whether they're having a good day or not. Making sure they're getting that positivity, giving them that hope, giving them that sense of that who they are is valid is really, really, really important. So I'm going to stop there. There's a few more slides I can go through, but I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to take the slides off. As I said, I'm happy to stick around. We started about 10 minutes late, so I can stick around I'll stick around about 10 minutes more if you guys want. But as I said, thanks for, I'll stop the sharing. And then if you need to jump off, thanks for being here. It was a pleasure to get to talk to you guys. In the meantime, if anybody has questions, you can type in chat, you can unmute your mic. Either or is fine with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen. It's really interesting.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Families, I'm going to put a link in the chat if you want to fill it out to get a free t-shirt for participating. And then I know I have a question, but if anybody else has a question while I'm doing this.
And families, that t-shirt will be for your student this time around. So when you fill out that Google form, it's for your Chancey students. And if you have more than one student, there's a place for you to include all of your students. So for you participating today, they will all get a shirt.
Okay. Anybody have any questions?
Dr. Rosen, I was wondering, and I know you said you did like some behavioral therapy with kids. Are there any like frontal lobe exercises or things that you do to help kids strengthen that?
Unfortunately, at the moment, there are not any non-medication based things that modify frontal lobe activity that we know of. As a field, we've spent the last 40 years trying to come up with non-medication alternatives. to help, for attention training and things like that. Unfortunately, we have not successfully been able to do that. The good thing is medication for ADHD is safe and effective for most kids, and does do a good job of bringing that frontal lobe up to speed. And I didn't really talk about medication, but I can answer questions about that as well. What we know about treatment is that medication helps with that frontal lobe issue, with those core symptoms, with the inattention, the hyperactivity, the impulsivity. It doesn't always necessarily help with the other problems, with behavior, emotion, organization. We do have really good interventions that can help with that. Ways to help kids learn to control their behavior, help parents and teachers monitor behavior, help kids learn to manage their emotions better, help them learn some organizational skills. So that is something we do have interventions for. But unfortunately, it's an attention training exercise that works is kind of the holy grail, and we just haven't found it yet.
There is a question a parent had asked could you speak a little bit more about the subset of ADHD, the sluggish cognitive processing?
Sure. And I will say this up front, that's a terrible name. Sluggish cognitive tempo is a terrible name. I don't know why that is the name they came up with. It's descriptive, but it's not very flattering. So sluggish cognitive tempo, as we call it, it's sort of a unique presentation of ADHD. It's not that uncommon, but what it really is, sort of, we see with these kids is oftentimes they're underactive, either cognitively or sometimes physically. They're just really slow processing. So it's not that they're as intelligent as typical kids. They're able to learn. It just takes them, it's harder for them to process. They tend to process things slower. The result is they're slower to kind of learn and encode things, and they're also a lot slower to retrieve them. That filing cabinet issue I mentioned, that's a really big issue for kids with ADHD. Is there's what we call recall and what we call recognition, which are different types of memory. Recognition is you see three things and you know which one is the right one. Recall is I ask you to come up with the answer yourself. What we see in kids with a sluggish cognitive tempo is they're oftentimes, recognition they're usually okay with, but recall is a real challenge. They have a really hard time generating ideas quickly. They have a really hard time organizing their thoughts. Oftentimes, and we see this across the board, not just with sluggish cognitive tempo, but oftentimes writing becomes is a real challenge for these kids, because the ability to hold the information in their head and organize it long enough to be able to write it in a coherent way can be a real challenge. So it's not, it's a type of ADHD. It's not that it's, and the same medication and same treatment options work with it, but it's a presentation that oftentimes I think gets missed because it's, we tend to associate ADHD with overactivity. We tend to associate ADHD with too much. And with kids with sluggish cognitive tempo, it's much more an issue of too little. They're underactive. They're, oftentimes they can, emotionally they can seem kind of flat. They can just kind of be there. And it's just because that processing just doesn't happen quite as quickly as it needs to.
There was another question, Dr. Rosen. Do you think, or do you find that kids with ADHD have more trouble with retaining information in the short term or long term?
Both, but in different ways. So the short term is what we call working memory. It's that ability to hold more than one thing in your head. Kids with ADHD can hold something, and here's the thing, we have a limited amount of information we can keep in our head. So if any of you guys are old enough to have actually had to remember phone numbers, I know I'm starting to date myself with that, but you think about the thing where you had to remember a phone number and you repeat it to yourself over and over again, and then you go to dial it and you forgot it because you had that information in your head as long as nothing else was interfering. And the moment you pick up the phone, it disappeared. Kids with ADHD have that issue with a lot of stuff. So the inflow and outflow, as we put it, is much quicker. So they can put something in their head, but something else replaces it very quickly. And that's why the whole multi-step thing where you ask them to do, 4 things and they do half of one of them. They just have that difficulty keeping things in their head. Long-term, the issue is not that they don't remember things. It's their ability to recall it. So what you'll find is that they won't remember things and then later they will. You'll ask them a question and you'll ask them where something is and they won't have any idea what you're talking about. And then a week later, they'll find it. And and you forgot that you asked them, but they'll remember. It's that issue of when they open their filing cabinet, things aren't in neat color-coded files. They've got to sort through a huge mound of papers to find that one thing that they're looking for. So you see problems with both, but they're different problems. But as far as memory goes, kids with ADHD don't actually have memory problems in the way that we think about memory problems. It's that issue of working memory, of keeping things active in their head, and then that long-term, being able to pull things up when they need to.
Miss
Hi.
Allen. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. And I'm sorry, I had an appointment, so I had to join late, and I really wanted to be here for this. So I'm an adult with ADHD, and I've been in the home with my 3 ADHD children. So I have inattentive type, and so does my oldest daughter. She's a straight A student, AP classes. She does not look like she has ADHD. My younger daughter is in the 6th grade. And basically, I found out she's been skipping school at home because her camera's off and she doesn't say anything, and she's hyperactive. And so is my son, who is 6. This is his first year at Chancey. He's in the 1st grade. Since he came home in March of last year, basically, he has been with me almost the entire time he's been in school. He has sensory processing disorder as well. I think this time he's been home with me has been very beneficial for me as a parent because I get to see the way that he thinks. And I understand how he was behind. Sometimes I want to cry when he's in small group because I watch him get lost so quickly. And his confidence dies immediately. And I want to yank him out sometimes. And I'm like, hey, buddy, come on, Braxton. You've got this, but just the smallest, as a person with ADHD, I know how our minds are. We're constantly misreading people and looking at people and feeling, you just apply personalization to everything, but so I guess my question, I'm afraid to send him to school. Primarily because he couldn't sit still before. Now, the things are even more restricted. I can imagine that, one, it would be disruptive, even more disruptive for the other children who are there, who do learn better in person, and for the teacher who doesn't have the time. And then for him, who will only hear, Braxton, can you sit down? Braxton, can you sit down? I don't know. I don't know what to do with that. I just kind of threw that out there. But I guess as far as confidence, how do we, and I do try to praise him. I did take some good notes from some of the things that you said, especially about praising character, because he says things that I'm sure haven't been said to him, but he's processed them. I'm just not good at school, and I'll never learn how to read.
And it starts very early, and that's the thing. You mentioned your son is 6, and this is what I was saying about kids just get kind of beaten down and worn down very quickly. And I will say, just first off, for those of you who are teachers, I spent 5 months. My then 3-year-old spent 5 months at home. I'm of the opinion now that all teachers and daycare workers should be paid at least $8 million a year. I think we can all agree on that. And coming back to school, the COVID precautions are going to be a particular challenge for kids with ADHD, both physically. I don't know how you're going to get kids with ADHD to not chew on their masks. But that issue of confidence is a really important one. And this is the thing that's so hard for kids with ADHD, is that in many ways for kids, it takes up a huge part of kids' life. It takes up more than half their day. It's where so much of the evaluation happens. It's where they get, it's their feedback outside the home. It's where they're getting evaluation from teachers, from parents, from peers. And schools, you could not design a worse environment for a kid with ADHD, because it's a situation where they have to control, they have to sit still, they have to control their bodies. They've got to focus. They've got to pay attention to the things that are the least interesting in the room. You know, and here's the thing, even I mean, I see this with my 4-year-old, and I'm sure you guys see this with your kids. Adults are the least interesting stimulation in the room, unless we're really upset or we're giving them something. Kids are always going to be more interesting. So you have these situations where, and you know, and I mean, even in video, I mean, kids pick up on this, and they know kids are very sensitive to what they're not good at. Mm-hmm. And so this is such a challenge for kids with ADHD is helping them be able to feel confident, helping them be able to feel valid, to feel valued, because they're put in environments where kids with ADHD hear no, don't, stop all day. Mm-hmm. And not just teachers, parents, peers, pets. I mean, you know, dog's going to growl at a kid with ADHD who's all up in their face and probably not going to growl at their sibling who's sort of gently petting them.
No, like seriously, my little Yorkie,
mm-hmm.
She only barks at breakfast.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Even with that, I mean, there's so much there. So helping kids, for one thing, giving kids a chance to be in environments that they're good at, where they are good at things. One thing that can be really helpful with kids is what we call mastery teaching. And that's where if you want them to learn something, you have them teach it to you. I cannot overemphasize how much kids with ADHD like being the expert. Giving them a chance to be an expert, giving them a chance to show that they know something. And oftentimes one of the best, it's also a very valuable way for them to learn. Kids, we all learn better when we teach than when we don't. I mean, for all you parents who've been home with your kids, think about the amount of like school stuff you had forgotten that you've learned. If you've got a 4th or 5th grader, you probably know how to do fractions now. I'm jealous. I don't remember how to do fractions. You know, you probably know a lot more. Remember that show, Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? Well, now you guys, if you have a 5th grader, you have to be as smart as a 5th grader because you have to help them. You know, so giving kids so you think about how much you have to learn something in order to be able to teach it. But that can be really motivating for kids. It can also really give them, you know, even if it's just them with you, that sense of being able to teach you something, being able to show you something. It's a way for them to demonstrate knowledge. And when they do it, let them make mistakes. Even if you know they've got that wrong, let them make mistakes, and then you can make the mistake and see if they can point it out. When they teach you something, you know, yes, if you've got a 1st grader, you probably know how to do single-digit addition, but get one wrong. Okay, so 4 + 2, that's 8, right? See if he catches it. That can, you know, it can give kids a sense of achievement and a sense of, like I said, it really can kind of help with that confidence of if you can teach your parents, if you can teach somebody else, you feel like you know it. I can tell you this as a professor, and I'm guessing those of you who are teachers probably feel this too. The feeling of accomplishment when you teach a class, you feel like you know it a lot better than when you actually learned it. I feel more nervous about teaching something than I ever did about learning it. Because I could sit in back of class and half learn it and do a crossword puzzle at the same time. But if I'm up front and somebody asks me, and I'm supposed to be the expert, someone asks me a question and I don't know it, oh boy. So that sense of sort of, it's a different type of learning, but something that kids with ADHD benefit from really well. But also then giving them chances to do, giving them a chance to do the things that they like to do and they do well. If a kid likes video games, let them show you how to play video games. You will be worse than them. They will be better than you, and they will legitimately beat the pants off of you. Let them.
Yeah.
You know, if your kid's a good artist, let them draw with you. Just kind of help them highlight the things they do well and help them feel like, and this is another really important part, help them feel like the things they do well are as important as the things that they don't do well. Help them feel like the things that they're good at are as valuable as the things that they're not. That can go a long, long way with kids with ADHD.
And will this presentation be available?
It's being recorded, and also I sent the slides to Mr. Kale. Mr. Kale, you're welcome to send these slides out to whoever you're welcome to share them with parents. Anything that I put up here is, the more people who can see it, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, we recorded this session. I apologize. I started about maybe 5-10 minutes into it. I'd forgotten. But yeah, I can send the slides to you, Miss Allen.
And Mr. Cahill, one thing I'd like to add, Miss Allen, I thank you for sharing I just want to introduce myself to parents on this call. I'm Mr. Swim. I'm the mental health practitioner at Chancey, and I'm another resource that's available whether we continue virtually or when we go back in person. If you'd like an additional support for your student, I meet one-on-one with students. I know Mr. Cahill and I are talking about trying to start some groups as well. So definitely reach out to me if you feel like your student might need some additional support.
That would be great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I've got probably time for one more question. Any other questions?
Well, parents, thank you again.
Well,
And
I have one more.
please.
Sorry, Mr. Rosen, do you, you said you're a professor, and I'm sorry I don't have the invite like in front of me. Do you practice?
So yes, there's information on the first slide. So I have a small private practice. Most of my job is teaching and research. I do have a small private practice where I do work with families. We also just started up an evaluation clinic that's it's through a grant for the Crusade for Children. It is to evaluate kids for ADHD. Even if your kids had ADHD or been diagnosed, we do their evaluations. Then we do personalized recommendations and feedback with parents. They are extremely low cost. You don't need insurance. You don't need a referral. Most families, based on income, it'll be anywhere from between $20 to $90 for the whole thing. So that's something that I could definitely recommend as well.
Thank you. I'll be in touch.
Absolutely. Alrighty. Well, I've actually probably got to jump on off. I got to get my kid ready for bed. So it was great to be here. I apologize that we ran a little bit long. As I said, I like to talk, and then we also did start a little bit late. But if anybody has any further questions, Mr. Cahill has my contact information. You guys are welcome to email me as well. And it was a pleasure to talk to everybody. And thanks for having me.
Thank you again, sir.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, parents. This was great. Bye.